QSO Today, episode 203, Mike Marsh G1IAR. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, whose fine rigs should be on your field day table or in your shack, and by QRP Labs, creators of the QCX Transceiver Kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth 4Z1UG, your host. Many of us began our ham radio journey by becoming listeners to broadcast radio first. Whether we love music or talk, it doesn't matter. For some, like my guest today, this love for audio becomes a life's work. Mike Marsh, G1IAR, is in love with mastering sound and owes his interest in ham radio to enhancing his professional career in the recording industry. Mike is also the co-host of the TX Factor video podcast, one of my favorite topical amateur radio shows on the internet. Mike will confirm that his involvement in TX Factor opens wide the most interesting aspects of the amateur radio hobby. Mike shares his ham radio story, TX Factor, and an insider's look at a mastering audio studio in this QSO Today. G1IAR, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
4Z1UG, this is G1IAR. Morning, Eric.
Mike, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started when I was very young. My interest actually in ham radio came into my teens, but initially I got really interested in all things radio, basically. I was a massive music fan as a youngster, and this is a big part of how I got into amateur radio. As an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old, I was absolutely into listening to music on the radio and fascinated by the medium and just the fact that the presenter could connect with you as a listener. And it was also, that was something that I actually wanted to end up doing. I wanted to become a DJ as an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old after listening to Radio Luxembourg. It was into the early hours of the night as a youngster. And my dad had a reel-to-reel tape machine back in the day. And I used to actually make my own radio shows. And I know a lot of us who were into music and into perhaps broadcasting, that was kind of one of the ways we did it. So that was one of the ways I really got interested in radio. Then after listening to broadcast radio, I wanted a better radio to listen to. So I was tuning around the bands, and then I was listening to police radio and the emergency services, like the ambulance. And I was just fascinated by the fact that you could listen to all these different broadcasts on one little radio. So listening to the police and listening to the emergency services just got me thinking a little bit more. And then in the UK in 1981, CB radio came around. It was legalized. And really that was my doorstep to amateur radio. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I started on CB radio. Some people see that as a bit of a no-no. But for me as a teenager, CB radio was just like, whoa, this is the best toy ever. You can plug your radio in and talk to anybody. And back then, remember in 1981-82, the propagation conditions were fantastic. So here was me with a very basic CB radio that was listening to stations coming in from all over the continent. Even America, a little bit like 10 meters works, now. This was 11 meters, of course, and it was fantastic. So CB radio was my doorstep to amateur radio, so much so I was so hooked on it that even as a cyclist, I had a CB radio and an aerial on my push bike, which was which a lot of people took the mickey out of me for that, because I was just super keen on radio the whole time. Through my school days, we started a CB radio club at the school because lots of other teenagers back at that time were also interested. And of course, this was pre-social media, pre-anything like that. It was a real kind of new toy. Then once I got into CB radio, I got even more interested in other aspects of radio and found out about amateur radio and bought myself a Daiwa Search 9. It was just a receiver. Obviously, it didn't have a license by then, so you could only listen. And this Search 9 receiver was basic, obviously, but again, it was a new toy, and I could listen to new things, local repeaters, for example. And I remember taking the Search 9 receiver into school one day because I was talking to my physics teacher about radio and amateur radio, and he was fascinated by it too. And I said to him, can I bring the Search 9 receiver into school for one of the physics lessons? Because the Space Shuttle Columbia is going over right in the middle of one of our physics lessons. And if I can just sling an aerial out of the window, perhaps we could see if we could hear the Space Shuttle go over. And would you believe it, bang on cue, Space Shuttle Columbia flew overhead. This is in 1983. And it was Owen Garriott, who was the commander at the time, W5LFL. And we were just completely gobsmacked that we could hear this QSO going on via the Space Shuttle Columbia whilst we were at school. And Owen was he was actually the first radio ham in space. So it's always a special moment for me that I'll never, ever forget in my kind of radio career, if you like. And that then led me on to going, right, I want to play amateur radio.
As we know, the Space Shuttle Columbia blew up upon takeoff, I think, in, 1985, 86?
Yeah, that's right. Very sad. Yes, I remember that. And, of course, the footage is still there for all to view. And
right, on YouTube. What did was it an amateur radio contact that you were listening to with that Daiwa SR9 receiver?
Yeah, it must have been. I'm just trying to rack my brains now and my memory. It must have been an amateur radio contact because Owen was he was transmitting on 2 meters.
Oh, okay.
I don't actually remember what he said, who he was talking to, or anything like that, but I guess I was just kind of in awe of the fact that we were listening to the space shuttle going overhead. You know, this is a real live astronaut, and I was in my classroom at school, and everybody was tuning in. You know, so it was a big moment.
Could we back up just a little bit? You said something that interested me. You said that you were using a general coverage receiver and you were hearing police and ambulances. Did in the UK, were those services in the high frequency bands in those rather than VHF, UHF, or were you actually using a receiver that was already up in the VHF range?
Yeah, very originally, I was just using a basic FM radio receiver, which should have probably only received between around about 87 megahertz to about 108 megahertz. But the radio that I had would go kind of just either side of those areas a little bit. And certainly the ambulance broadcasts were tunable at the lower part of the kind of I think around about 80 megahertz. I used to pick them up. So the police, listening to the police came later via a scanner as well. I remember I had a scanner, and also when I got my first amateur radio license, I couldn't wait to take the lid off and modify it so that you could listen out of band. You know, bit naughty perhaps, but I always understood that if you were listening out of band and you didn't act on anything you heard, or tried to transmit, of course, then it was kind of they turned a blind eye to it, you know.
Well, did you have to have a receiving license in those days in the UK?
For radio, no. A television license, yes, but not for radio, no.
Oh, but the television license was to pay for the BBC or something like that, right? If you owned a television, then you paid a surcharge every year for
you had an annual license, and that's right, it was for the BBC. There were, back in those days in the UK, there were only 3 television channels, which sounds like a joke now, but ITV, independent television was funded by adverts, but the BBC was funded by the license fee, which was, I think back then, was actually orchestrated by the post office. So, and they had a two-tier system, which was quite strange. If you had a black and white television, if you remember that, then you had a cheaper license because you were only watching in black and white. But if you wanted color, then you had to pay a much higher rate. I can't remember what the charges were because as a teenager back then, I wasn't paying the bills.
Well, Israel's the same way. There's a television tax or television license tax that when you buy a new TV or have an old one, they also charge you a yearly fee, which they were used to be pretty hard about on the one hand. On the other hand, I have two TVs here, and I never watched TV, but I needed them as monitors, so I actually pulled out the tuners and schlepped these TVs downtown to the licensing office to show them I didn't have tuners in them, and therefore I was released from the tax. Well, that's very interesting. One other thing, you said that you used to make radio shows on a reel-to-reel tape recorder that your dad owned. Did you ever share those tapes with your friends? Did you have an audience?
I didn't know. It was very much a kind of bedroom recording studio situation only. I think I might have just ended playing them back to myself, possibly bored my brother with them at the time, but he wasn't in the least bit interested in what I was up to. So it was, nothing ever got aired. Nobody really heard it, and perhaps that's a good thing.
So we're right on the cusp of your getting your first license. When did you get your first license, and how old were you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, having heard the space shuttle, that really inspired me to get a license. And already being an active CB operator, there were other people on the bands locally that I used to talk to that were also interested in getting a radio ham license. So 2 or 3 of us took the plunge and decided to sit what was called the RAE, or the Radio Amateurs Examination in the UK, where back then it was a 2-tiered license. So you had the A class or the B class license that you ended up with. I was a B class licensee. I took the examination course at Exeter College, which is local to me, in, I think it was the autumn and winter period of 1983. So I was 16 years old, on the brink of turning 17. And it was, if I remember rightly, it was like a 10-week course. It was quite long. You had to go in on an evening, so I was going in after school, and I was also actually sitting my school examinations at the time. So I was kind of in exam and learning mode, which is a great time, I think, because your brain's geared up for soaking up all the information you need. And because I was doing physics at school, the radio amateur exam was just like an extension of physics, really. Lots of electronics, lots of theory. So I loved it. The radio stuff was all new, but I was ready to soak that up. And I sat the RE, the radio amateurs exam, in the spring of 1984, and I got my pass. So 17 years old was when I got my first license. And my only license.
And that's the call sign you have now?
Absolutely, yeah. The call I've got now is the one I was given back in 1984, and it hasn't changed since then. I never ever took the examination any step further. As I said, it was a 2-tiered situation in the UK where you were either a B class licensee or an A class licensee. The difference was if you were a B class, you were only granted access to the VHF and UHF spectrum. If you were an A class licensee, then you had access to HF as well. But to do the A class license, you needed to learn Morse, and I just couldn't get my head around it. So being a B class licensee and being able to talk on VHF and UHF was fine for me. You know, that kind of ticked all the boxes. I was getting my buzz from radio just from that. And actually back then, because I was on the brink of starting work and all of that, I wasn't that bothered about the next step of amateur radio at the time. So I never actually took it any further. Ofcom, who are the governing body in the UK, in their infinite wisdom, decided. Let me see, I can't remember quite how long ago now, to grant all B-class licensees with the same privileges as A-class licensees without you having to do anything. So all of us B-class licensees back in the day when Ofcom said that just basically went, thank you very much, we'll have that. So I was then granted access to the HF bands, which I soaked up with open arms, but I didn't actually have to do anything for it. So I kind of feel like I've cheated my way into the system a little bit better. But if they dangle the carrot, you're going to take it.
Do you have any Elmers or mentors who helped you along?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, it probably stems back to the early days on CB. Lots of people locally were into CB radio, and a couple of guys really have been incidental in my radio career. Really, a guy called Dave Lee, call sign G6XUV, still licensed today, and I still talk to him regularly. And another guy called John Hartnell, G6YWX. Two guys who I've been friends with now for over 30 years. They were my mentors, really, because they were mad keen on radio as well, and it was with those guys that they really instilled my interest in amateur radio. They got licensed actually a year before I did, and seeing what they had and I didn't made me feel I want some of that. And it was actually John, G6YWX, it was his wife, Diane, who he talked into sitting the RAE course. And she said to me, why don't you come along and do it? And I couldn't wait to start. So those three people were absolutely kind of monumental in my early radio career, if you like. And I still talk to them all and see them regularly today, and they're still licensed and we're still playing the game.
Is there a rig, because it sounds to me like you had a number of rigs, but is there a rig that you had in your early ham radio career that still stands out as one that was exciting and new and fresh?
I guess your first radio that you ever get is probably always in your memory as being an exciting moment. My first radio, and you have to remember I was a teenager without much money back then, and I hadn't started work. And amateur radio equipment actually back in the day was really expensive. My first radio was a Yaesu FT290R with all of 2.5 watts output power, I remember. And for me, that was a game changer, because I then had my first radio that I could talk on the amateur bands. You could use repeaters. It did single sideband as well, which was a big step up from Citizens Band Radio, of course, which in the UK legally you could only use FM. So to have the Yaesu, the 290, albeit a very basic radio, that's a big memory for me. I do remember when I got my driving license, that I had to go mobile. Being able to drive around mobile with amateur radio as well was a big thing for me. So the 290 ended up in my first car, and I think at the time I had to couple it with I bought a Microwave Modules 30-watt linear amplifier, which had a preamp in, which of course when you go mobile is very useful. So that just gave me more scope in terms of getting into repeaters, talking to friends for a bit longer before you lost them. When you went over the brow of the hill. Where I live is very there are lots of hills and valleys around, so having that extra power was a big bonus to me. So yeah, that radio, I always hold that in high regard, even though it was so basic. As I got more interested into it, you want more radios, don't you? You can never just have one. I was, not strapped for cash, but not loaded, because I was still very young. So we looked into the whole thing of PMR radios, and one thing I still love today is getting an old radio that isn't actually cut out for the amateur bands and modifying it and getting it to work. So we did lots of stuff like that back in the day, where our radio equipment was actually very basic. It wasn't all singing, all dancing, bells and whistles HF radios. It was basic stuff that a lot of people were actually chucking away. I remember industries like the electricity board and the water board would be throwing away their communications radios, and they were modifiable for 2 meters FM. So we did that, with the guys I mentioned earlier. We would jump on a car boot sale, if you like, of those kind of radios, and we'd get in there, take the lids off and modify them. And a big part of being in the hobby for me is the electronic side of it, and the joy and the fun of taking the lid off something and and modifying it and getting it to work the way you want to. So lots of PMR equipment back in the day.
I think I can relate. I want to dig a little bit deeper. In the United States, Motorola and General Electric were the big public safety radio brands. What were the big public safety PMR radio brands in the UK at that time?
Okay, so I'm going to have to rack my memories now. I think it was Pi, P-Y-E. Motorola was a big name, but I think it was Pi that were one of the big PMR radios back in the day that a lot of the service industry would use.
Oh, okay. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Maybe we can find some pictures of some of those land mobile radios. I used to like to take the covers off, and just the smell of them. That was, this is for me.
Yeah, well, I was very much into that, and very, very soon the soldering iron became a key part of the shack just as much as the radio.
And now this message from ICOM America. By the time that you hear this podcast message about ICOM, Field Day might just be over. I hope that you took your ICOM rig into the field for a great weekend. The ham radio year is full of contests, grid square chasing, and other just fun on-the-air activities that can be enhanced using the latest ICOM rigs. The newest addition to the ICOM line is the 100-watt IC7610, a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the definition of the SDR transceiver. The new IC7610 uses an RF direct sampling system where the RF signals are directly converted into digital data, now capable of 110 dB RMDR, one of the best in its class to pull out those weak signals in a high-noise environment. With an independent dual receiver design, you can hunt and pounce on your next contest or just give a casual listen to the DX and other bands. The IC7610 employs dual Digicel preselectors that are very sharp RF filters to reduce the effect of very strong out-of-band signals. The IC7610 should be your first choice as you sharpen your on-the-air skills. The IC7300 is just about everybody's favorite high-performance and innovative 100-watt HF transceiver, priced to be everyone's next rig. With its RF direct sampling and 15 discrete bandpass filters, this is an ideal rig to chase DX, work the digital modes SSB and CW. With its beautiful and large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, with real-time spectrum scope, even the beginner can quickly master what's happening and where in any band. Finally, if you want the shack rig that will take you to the stars, then the 100-watt IC9100 is the rig for you. The IC9100 is an HF, VHF, and UHF all-mode rig that will allow you to begin to master the challenging modes, including meteor scatter and moon bounce. In the satellite mode, the IC9100 will even correct for Doppler shift as the satellite passes overhead. Of course, since you can do just about anything with the IC9100, you can take advantage of its independent dual receivers, digital IF filters, and an internal antenna tuner. So there you have it. ICOM has you covered as you think about your next rig to upgrade your ham shack and operation going forward. Be sure to try out these fine ICOM rigs at the nearest amateur radio store near you, or go to ICOM America's website by clicking on the links in this week's show notes page. Be sure to tell them that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. So let's jump ahead a little bit. What is your current rig? What do you like to do now?
Well, it's not just one, of course, because as you get older, you get greedier, don't you?
Yes, we do.
As you got more cash, you think, oh, I'll buy that one as well. So I can't narrow it down to just one, although I guess the main radio, in answer to your question, is my ICOM IC9100. I've always been a big fan of shacks in a box, where you've just got access to everything in one box. It's a space saver. It ticks all the boxes, and you can work wherever you want to work from one radio. And I did the same thing prior to that, and I've still got it. Is my Yaesu FT847, which was one of Yaesu's, I think it might have been the first shack in a box actually for Yaesu, going from HF right the way through to 70 centimeters. So, yeah, I've always been a big fan of those for the home base, and then for mobile work in the car. I've actually got two radios in the car. It's an IC7100, that's the ICOM. And I've got a Yaesu FTM100D in the car as well for playing Fusion and digital mode. So, the dashboard's looking a little bit cluttered, and it's not easy these days to get radios into cars, but
right.
Thank goodness for suction mounts and stuff like that. That's been a game changer too. The fact that a lot of radios now, you can unclip the fronts and the face comes off. So that's made it a lot easier to go mobile without having a huge, great box sat on the dashboard likely to slide off at any given moment, So, but yeah, so the 9100 is probably my main radio. But I at home, I juggle between the 847 and the 9100.
ICOM is a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast, and I did some research into the 9100, and what I discovered was that if you're doing satellite communications, crossband, that the 9100 will actually do the frequency shifting for the Doppler effect in order to, as the satellite is flying over and twisting, you kind of change the frequency ever so slightly in order to be able to, still have an intelligible conversation. Are you using it for satellite modes at all?
Do you know, I haven't done that yet myself. With a little side project that I'm involved in, I've dipped my toes into amateur satellites, but I'm still learning. So actually, if I'm being honest, I probably don't feel confident to get on there and play the game without making a fool of myself. But you're right, the 9100 does that Doppler correction. And I think prior to that, it was the Kenwood TS2000, which was the only radio that did that. And the ARIS team, who do all the International Space Station contacts with the astronauts, use that radio for the very reason that it does that Doppler correction, which of course is it's crucial when you're working satellites that are coming towards you and going away from you at one heck of a speed. So, but I want to get into that. I've dipped my toes, as I say. I'm learning the kind of etiquette. I'm always, with my radio hobby, I guess I've always been a listener and a watcher before I've been a button pusher, So I like to kind of, I like to feel like I know what I'm doing before I make a fool of myself and prove that I don't, So yeah, satellites is something I want to have a crack at. I have been listening to some of the FM satellites, which I think are probably a bit more basic and a bit easier to get your head around as a newbie. And, of course, there are so many new satellites being launched what seems like every 5 minutes at the moment, New CubeSats going up left, right, and center, which is super exciting. It's just another extension to our hobby at the moment, which gives you another facet to grab a hold of and play something really exciting and really different, Yeah,
it's very exciting. Just an aside here, you say you have the Yaesu FTM100D, and that's a System Fusion radio. How popular is System Fusion there in the UK?
Oh, really popular, and it's gaining in popularity the whole time. Of course, it's still a pretty new format, to be fair, and Yaesu are on the brink of releasing radios to do that. There's the 400 and the 9300 now. So it's a new thing for the manufacturers, this whole digital voice thing. So, but yeah, it's really escalated quite dramatically now. There's a bit of a hub in England now. CQ UK is a big meeting point for a lot of Fusion users, and I think when it's like bees to a honeypot. When you have somewhere where you know there's going to be lots of people to talk to, everybody tunes into that frequency, and they're all there. So Fusion's growing really, really fast. I'm really glad that I can do it mobile as well now. I can do it from home too, but just to go mobile with it and perhaps use a local gateway or a repeater has opened up the world of QSOs to, literally all over the world. I'm talking to friends locally, and then a station from Australia will break in and want to join the QSO, and things like that are so exciting. I absolutely love it. Some people will say it's not real radio, particularly if they're using a computer to access the network. But I don't have a problem with it. I think it's all radio in one form or another. And if we're bringing the whole of the worldwide amateur radio community together with digital voice, what's not to like,
Well, I think the fusion of all these technologies is certainly in the spirit of ham radio. It takes a certain amount of technical expertise, to make this all play. So I think I agree with you. What's your favorite operating mode?
My favorite operating mode, it's probably 2 meters VHF FM when the conditions have just gone crazy. I listen to HF a lot. As I say, I'm more of a listener than an operator actually a lot of the time. But often with my HF setup, which is not fantastic, it's fairly basic. I've just got an HF vertical in the garden, which I never actually think performs very well. And every time I try and talk to people, I don't get an answer back. So perhaps that's because I'm not running 3,000 watts through a multi-beam, multi-element antenna, But yeah, there's something about 2 meters FM when there are lift conditions on and you're hearing stuff way outside of where you might normally hear. I find that the most exciting, actually.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made then for your education and career?
Yeah, it kind of did, because ham radio for me was all about electronics. It was all about geekery. It was all about experimenting and stuff like that. And with ham radio comes lots of knobs and lots of buttons. So I when I was a teenager and they ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up? How can you answer that question as a teenager? That's almost impossible. But I knew that I had to do a job that involved knobs, faders, lights, buttons, things I could press. My parents would tell you as a kid, I would press every button at every opportunity wherever we were, whether it was in an elevator or a shop somewhere, I'd be the one pressing all the wrong buttons at all the wrong time, So I just knew that I wanted to do something technical, because that's where my head was at. And as a kid, I actually wanted to be a television cameraman. And back in the day, there were only 3 television channels, and I really wanted to work for the BBC. So that was what I wanted to do, because I saw that as something fun to get into, something interesting. But, most of all, there was buttons and knobs and cameras and lights and all that to play with, and possibly radio as well. So it really instilled a technical inspiration into my head about what I wanted to do for a career. I applied for the BBC. But unfortunately, got the letter back saying there are no spaces at the moment. Maybe if there were 300 channels like there are now, maybe I could get a job easy. But back then, it was quite a closed shop. So you were lucky to get a technical position within the broadcasters. So I stayed on at school doing my A-level exams, because I didn't have a job to go to and I didn't want to just bum around doing nothing. So staying on at school, doing A-levels, 1 year through the course, it's a 2-year course, I was getting really fed up of school. I'd had enough of learning. I wanted to get out and work, but I didn't have a job to go to. And by chance, I just happened to walk past the school had a notice board, a jobs notice board in one of the hallways. And I never looked at it, because it was always full of of what I considered boring jobs, like working in retail or working in the hotel trade or stuff like that, which is key to the area that I live in. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted buttons and I wanted knobs and I wanted, things to press. And walking past the notice board one day, there was a job advertised and it said, recording studio trainee technician wanted, apply here. And I thought, okay, well, it's not TV, but it's a recording studio. Hang on, they're going to have buttons and faders and knobs and microphones, and I got to go for that. And I had massively into music. I was listening to, as we said earlier on, I was listening to the radio like an anorak from like 8 or 9 years old. So music was a big passion of mine. And DJing and stuff like that. I was running a mobile disco, I remember at the time. So playing music was a big thing for me. So can you imagine how I felt when I had the opportunity of possibly making music with this job that was advertised? So long story short, I applied for the job and I got it on a trainee basis, and started my career as a 17-year-old trainee recording engineer, completely making it up as you go along. Figuring out the way around the mixing desk, and all the channel strips and how to get stuff to work. And this is back in the day where we were using an open reel, multi-track reel-to-reel recorder as well. So, very quickly I had to learn how to operate a 16-track multi-track tape machine, and coerce 4 or 5 band members who might have been arguing about who was playing what at any given time to actually get on with it and record some music, So they were great times, and lots of late nights. As a 17-year-old, I was probably breaking every health and safety rule that they would throw at you now, because we were working until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. That's what you do, when you're in the zone and you're making music, you don't stop because it's 5 o'clock and it's tea time. So, we just kept going, and that was the start of my career. And yes, I think amateur radio played a part in that, simply from the technical point of view, and the fact that there were buttons and things to press and lights to watch and microphones and stuff. So absolutely, amateur radio has been key in me ending up where I am now.
I was going to say, you have a business called the Exchange Mike Marsh Mastering Studios. What do you do in your business, and how is it different from a recording studio? And has ham radio contributed to the success of this business?
Yeah, mastering is different from recording. I spent 2 years at the recording studio that I worked at, and long story short, the guy who I worked for, his brother, who used to work for Island Records in the UK, worked for a mastering studio in London. He was setting up the Exchange, which was the company I originally worked at, as a new business venture, because the bosses at Island Records decided to not really invest in the mastering studio that they had there in the way that he wanted. So they decided to jump ship and set their own business up. And he basically called on his brother to ask whether I would be available to go and help put the studio together and do the technical installation with them. For me, as a teenager living in countryside Devon in the UK, to go to London with this opportunity of setting up a mastering studio was, that was like the best thing to ever happen to me. So the boss of the studio in Devon said to his brother, yep, Mike's on his way. And they said, well, it's probably only going to be, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks work, just to get all the technical installation sorted, get the studios put together. Once you've done it, you can go back to Devon and carry on recording. And that 3 to 4 weeks has kind of turned into the last 30 odd years of my life. Long story short, I never went back to Devon. I really enjoyed what I was seeing in this mastering studio, that I didn't want to leave. And mastering is different from recording. It's the next stage on from recording, where you've obviously got all the bands playing their instruments, singing along, making mistakes, having arguments in the studio, and lots of downtime. Mastering is the stage where you receive a finished mix from a recording studio. So the tape back then that you would have been given, it would have been either a half-inch open reel or a quarter-inch open reel tape. The tape that you're given to work on is the finished mix. Now, sometimes those mixes don't actually end up sounding very good. And even if that comes from a top recording studio with a top engineer and a top producer, it might still have needed work doing to it. And that's where the mastering studio comes in. Initially, back in the day when I started mastering in 1987, we were mastering for vinyl. So a 7-inch single, a 12-inch single, or your 33 RPM LP was the way people bought music, as well as cassettes, of course. But vinyl was the key carrier of music back in the day. So we received master tapes from various different studios for various different artists that wanted to put their music out on vinyl. And it ranged from, very well-established artists to guys who were self-funding their own releases and didn't have a record contract back in the day, So you were working on all kinds of music from all genres, recorded in all different types of setups. And mastering really it's about getting into the sound that you're given and improving on it if you can. And I'm talking about by using equalizers, compressors, and getting into that sound and achieving the best thing that you can from the sound of the mix that you're given. In the instance of, say, working on an album, you might have 10 or 12 tracks that a band want to release. Nowadays, those tracks might be recorded over quite a long period of time in lots of different studios by lots of different engineers on lots of different equipment. And normally that means they all sound very different. So the role of the mastering engineer is absolutely to pull all of those differences together and make everything sound like it was all done at the same time in the same place, so that when you, the music listener, puts on an album or puts on a track, they all work together and nothing jumps out as sounding too bassy, too trebly, too quiet, all of that kind of thing. So it's quite a responsible role in finalizing the sound, and the choice of what you do to those mixes is down to you. You're given kind of carte blanche to get in there and do what you feel is right. So you have to really go with your gut reaction a lot of the time.
Well, it sounds like it's more art than science then, right? You've had to train your ears to, hear the quality product. Absolutely, yeah. It is very much like that. You have to, I think working in music, it's a very creative industry anyway, but you have to have an idea in your head about what sounds right and what doesn't. And it's like a musician, they know the way they want to play something. They know when they write music, they want to create a vibe by what this piece of music they've written. Well, I'm doing the same thing with the sound that they give me, because when I put a track on at the studio, pretty much within about 15 to 30 seconds, you know what's good about it or you know what's bad about it. You get this kind of instant gut reaction, and if it sounds great, the hair on the back of your neck stands up. If it doesn't, then you've got your work cut out to get in there and do what you've got to do. But I love what I do, because all music should sound great. There's no excuse for any music to not sound good. And I don't mean from a playing point of view or singing out of tune or stuff like that. I mean from a technical point of view, from just that engaging sound when you put something on and you just go, whoa, that's why I do what I do. And now this message from QRP Labs. I hope that you caught Hans Summers' G0UPL's speech to the FDIM QRP conference in Dayton last month, featured on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. I will put a link in the show notes so that you can find this very interesting and entertaining talk. Hans spoke about the development and the design of his QRP Labs QCX transceiver, where his objective was to break all of the rules and create the best Arduino-based single-band transceiver kit at a low price. Hans has done exactly that, and the chances of working another QCX on the air gets better every day. The QCX is a feature-rich, high-performance, single-band 5-watt CW transceiver kit with a whisper beacon and built-in alignment and test equipment. It is available for 40, 60, 80, 30, 20, and 17-meter bands. It uses a rotary encoder synthesized tuning, a VFO AB and split, a built-in iambic keyer, a CW decoder, and more. All of this for under $50 US. Let me say this again, in case you didn't hear me correctly. Under $50 US. So when you're looking for your next ham radio kit project, go directly to QRP Labs by clicking on the link on the QSO Today show notes pages. This is the best way that you can tell Hans that Eric at QSO Today sent you. QRP Labs is my first choice for ham radio kit building projects. It should be yours too. And now back to QSO Today. Is there a mastered recording that maybe many of us have heard that you've done so we can point to it and say, well, that came from Mike Marsh?
Oh, okay. There's lots of music over the years for lots of different artists from lots of different genres. I've worked one act that I have worked with for a long period of time is the Chemical Brothers, who are a UK-based electronic dance music act, I guess you'd call it, who've been very successful with every album. I think it's been a #1 album in the UK. So they're those guys are two guys that I've worked with since they started their career, and we're still working together now. So that's a really special relationship we've got. And it works like that because we both know what each other expects. You have this kind of, when you work with an artist and then you work with them again in the future, you have this understanding with each other about what you're trying to achieve, and that's really good. So lots of artists that I've worked with, luckily they keep coming back for more, which is nice. In fact, actually, right now as we speak, my studio holds the #1 single in the UK and the global #1 iTunes single for an artist called Calvin Harris. His current single called One Kiss is #1 in the UK. It's been there for 7 weeks in a row, actually. So, and that's a big buzz for me, to be working in the industry still, and then seeing what you're working on resonate with other people and become hugely successful. That's a great feeling.
Does the the proliferation of the internet and big bandwidth and all that stuff, has it made it easier for perhaps artists to send you their work from abroad rather than deliver tapes to you?
Yeah, for sure. The internet for the music industry was a game changer, full stop. Not only from a sales point of view, and the industry was very, very slow to embrace the internet and online music sales, and that's why the industry took a huge downturn in revenues because of illegal piracy and stuff like that. But from what you're saying, from moving masters around, moving tracks around, the internet has been absolutely incremental in me being successful in my business venture now, because I moved out of London in 2014. We got kicked out of our studio by the landlords, who decided to turn it into prime location central London apartments. So I moved back to Devon. I couldn't have done that 30 years ago when reels of tape were being shipped around and artists were bringing stuff to the studio personally. I would have been out of work, because living in Devon, which is 150 miles away from London, that's way too far outside of the music business to be successful in what you're doing. You're just too far away. Whereas now the internet has completely turned that on its head, and I've got clients all over the world: Australia, Japan, in the States, East Coast and West Coast, and we're working on music where they'll send me high-resolution WAV files over the internet. I can work on that track within an hour or two and send it right back to them, within a few hours. So the internet has absolutely turned the whole speed of workflow on its head.
And you can work from anywhere.
Absolutely, yeah, that's
pretty
the
amazing.
beauty. Yeah, I mean, essentially, you could end up working from a laptop as long as you've got an internet connection, and you can understand what you're doing. You could work from a laptop, but when you're working in a studio, you need a sonically controlled environment that you're making key decisions on somebody's music. You need to be absolutely sure that you know what you're doing and you know what you're hearing. So, my studio, I work at the same studio, and in fact, even though I moved the studio at the end of 2014, I actually built the exact same studio space that I spent 30 years working in London. So to the millimeter, the studio that I'm actually in now is a carbon copy exactly of the very original studio that I started at in 1987. And for me, it was a no-brainer. If I was being kicked out of my old studio that I knew so well and I completely understood the sound of it within that room, I had to recreate that somewhere else. To go to a new environment and then have to spend 6 months learning what I was listening to and essentially practicing then on people's music was, that was unacceptable to me. If I was moving, I had to build the environment that I was used to so that when I switched the new studio on for the first time, I could hit the ground running,
Oh, well, you and I had talked about this before we pushed the record button. In that we were talking about using audio editing software and how difficult it is. I mean, you have a workflow that you've created over a period of time, and to change that workflow, I think you said it beautifully in terms of changing the environment. All of a sudden, you have to learn how to re-listen, and that would
Absolutely.
be a big impediment, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and any artist who's making music today, and lots of artists actually now make the music themselves. Even established artists, that there aren't the budgets for an assistant engineer, a producer, or things like that. Lots of people have had to learn how to ply their trade by doing it themselves. So one of the big conversations I have with a lot of artists is if you've got a piece of software or, recording software that you're used to using, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Carry on using it. Who cares if it might be dated? Who cares if it might be an old version of that software that you're using? If you've got your head around it and your workflow is good, stick with it, because sometimes, especially because making music is such a creative industry and the engineering side of it as well, if you're up against that brick wall of having to figure out how to work something in a program that you could have done really quickly using the other program, then you've just caused yourself so much extra stress, and the workflow gets ruined. You start to lose the impetus and the buzz of what you were doing because you're having to concentrate on driving the program rather than making the music.
Well, in the previous episode to yours last week, I interviewed Raul Midon, AE3RM, who is also a recording artist, and he was saying that he actually records all of his music in his basement studio. So he has all of his toys, all of his instruments, and all of his setup the way that he likes it, and he's now producing his or creating his sound in his basement, and I'm assuming then he sends it off for mastering to someplace. So that's very cool, and it's amazing that we have this ability now to be able to do this.
Yeah, well, everybody now is a DJ, everybody is a producer, everybody is a television maker because the technology that we've got available to us is just phenomenal for pretty minimal cost, really. You can set yourself up with high def cameras, great recording equipment, and if you're in that creative mind and you can get access to this gear, then the world is your oyster. Just look at YouTube now. I mean, there are people posting stuff that would never have had a chance with, let's say, an old video camera back in the day, So the fact that we can do a lot of these creative industries in what I call the DIY mode is just brilliant, But from my point of view, as a mastering engineer, people, if they're making their own music and recording their own music, they still like to give it to another guy just to have that other perspective on their finished project. And I think that's quite important in probably in whatever field you do, even with making television and stuff like that. Having that extra person cast their eye over what you're doing just takes you outside of their little box and gives it another dimension sometimes, and that's still really important.
Well, this is an excellent segue to you're the co-host of TX Factor, which is a video podcast. You do this along with Bob McCready, G0FGX, and Nick Bennett, 2E0FGQ. How did TX Factor start?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that started as basically two mates having a chat one day. Bob McCready, G0FGX, has been a long-term friend of mine. He was he still is a radio presenter. He worked on a local commercial radio station, local to me. He was breakfast show presenter on Orchard FM, which was a big commercial radio station in the southwest of the UK. One of my other friends, who we mentioned earlier on, Dave Lee, G6XUV, used to speak to Bob occasionally on amateur radio, and he got really friendly with Bob, and Bob used to say to him, "Oh yes, I'm working at the radio station," stuff like that. Dave said to me, "You need to speak to Bob," because he knew I was already DJing, and I was a mobile DJ and doing club DJ work and stuff like that, because that was my passion for music still. But I said to Dave, I would really love to get on the radio, do broadcast radio. And he said, "Well, you need to speak to Bob because he works there." And I thought, okay, yeah, that's the foot in the door. So I just remember, this is actually how it happened. I remember calling Bob via the talkie repeater on 2 meters one day, because he was mobile in the area, and David had given me he tipped me off that Bob was about. He said, "Bob's on TR, you've got to call him." So I was driving around in the car, got the radio on, and there was Bob. So we had a quick chat on the repeater, and he said, "Well, I'm over at the radio station tonight. Why don't you come over and just sit in and see what it's all about?" So of course I couldn't wait. So I drove straight over there, and we just hit it off straight away. We became really good friends. I admired what he was doing there. I was absolutely fascinated by broadcast radio. And once again, of course, you were sat there with more buttons, more knobs, lots of music, microphones, and a radio audience, So, yeah, I said to Bob, this is something I want to do, and the foot in the door with radio is you can't just go straight on the air. What are you going to sound like? Are you going to be okay? You've got listeners out there who you don't want to lose. So I think I had to make I made a demo tape in the commercial production studio next door, which the station manager would have listened to and then gone, "Yeah, it's okay, but it could be better. So you go back in and do another one." So the station manager made me record the demo tape a second time, and then I think he felt that was a little bit better. So maybe there's some mileage in getting you on the air. Then they asked me to do some what they call tech opping in the studio. The radio station was doing a lot of outside broadcasts. And of course, you have a presenter who's out and about somewhere or another. You need somebody back at the studio to make sure all the music's played in. This was a commercial station as well, so all the ad breaks needed playing in. And the boss said to me, "Well, why don't you come in and what you call drive the desk for one of these live outside broadcasts? And you can get your head round operating the equipment while you're on air, under pressure, and see how that goes." So I did that for a few weeks. And then I remember we had an outside broadcast which was being held at one of these huge kind of outdoor events, like a big fair. And I was tech opping the show one day, and the outside broadcast link went down. Now, back then, it was a telephone line that was providing the audio back and forth, and that link went down. So the the situation when that happens was you're on the edge of your seat, because basically there's nobody talking at the outside broadcast. You're back at the studio, now in control of the desk, and it's all down to you. So the kind of rules were you had to just play back-to-back music, keep the music coming, and hopefully the outside broadcast would come back up again, and you'd get the nod, and you'd carry on as if nothing had happened. Half an hour went by and the outside broadcast didn't come back. So I took a phone call I remember the white light flashed in the studio, which basically was an ex-directory telephone line that flashed a light in the studio. And the call was, Mike, you're going to have to come on and present the show. And I was like, okay, never done this before, under a little bit of pressure here. So, yeah, basically I had to come on the air and do the show until we got the OB link back again. And, of course, the bosses were listening. Bob, G0FGX, heard all about it as well. And then that evening, I got a phone call from the station manager who said, what are you doing next Saturday? And I said, well, I don't know, probably going down the pub with my mates or playing music somewhere, something like that. He said, you don't fancy doing a radio show, do you? And I was like, are you serious? So that's how my connection with Bob started. And I went in and started doing radio shows on commercial radio. And it was just like, whoa. It was something I'd always wanted to do, a boyhood dream from those reel-to-reel tape recordings of 8 or 9 years old. Suddenly I was on the air, So Bob was still breakfast show presenter there, and he remained there until the radio station was taken over, actually, by another one of these radio groups, as is the case with a lot of commercial stations now. And I was working in London as well at the same time while this was happening. So when Bob was still at the radio station, I actually hung up my headphones there because at the time I got married. I was doing a weekly commute to London because I'd moved myself back to Devon. So I was doing a 300-mile round trip to go to work at the Exchange, and I was burning out. So unfortunately, the thing that had to give was my radio show, because I used at the last stages of me doing my radio show, I used to do a self-produced dance music radio program where I was programming all the music myself. Initially, when I first started, you went into the radio station and you were told what to play. You had a playlist in front of you. You printed out your sheet and you played what you were told to play. To the latter part of me working at the radio station, I was doing my own self-produced radio show, which needed a lot of prep time. I've always been, I guess, a consummate professional. If you're going to do a job, do it well. So I was spending like 5, 6, 7 hours preparing this show every week, making sure it was current, making sure it was fresh, making sure that the listeners would enjoy what they were hearing, and that was just eating into the spare time that I already didn't have. So I hung up my radio headphones and decided I really had to just concentrate on mastering and my job and, my marriage at the time and stuff like that. So Bob and I, we didn't drift apart. We were still talking, but it was, maybe like only every 6 months or something like that, we'd have a catch up. And I remember it was 2013, probably in the summertime, we must have caught up on the air. It was either possibly even via the Torquay repeater, but it would have definitely come via ham radio. And we just hooked up again. And Bob said to me, he goes, I've got this idea about doing a video show, a TV show or a video podcast all about amateur radio. What do you reckon? And of course I said, well, that's a great idea. And at the time, nobody else was doing it, certainly in the UK anyway. And Bob said, well, why don't we take this further? Let's talk about doing it. But how are we going to do it? How are we going to film it? How are we going to record it? And then I remember saying to Bob at the time, hang on a minute, you remember Nick Bennett from Orchard FM? Like, he was Nick was the chief engineer for the group of radio stations that we worked at. So Nick was in charge of what you call like the racks room for transmission. He was in charge of all the equipment in the studio, all the stuff that went off to the transmitters. Nick, of course, was a licensed radio ham, and I said to Bob, well, you remember Nick, let's get in touch with him and see if he's up for it. So I think maybe Bob and I maybe we did a three-way Skype, or we met up, actually. I think perhaps actually I'm just racking my brains now. It would have been a curry and a beer. That's how all businesses start, isn't it? So
no, but you have to explain that for this audience. What is a curry? What is a curry and a beer?
A curry and a beer. It's a very English thing. So going out for a curry is that chicken curry and rice and poppadoms and naan breads. It's a restaurant thing, So it's very British, and of course there are beers that are involved in that as well, So we would have sat over the dinner table in a British curry house talking about TX Factor, and it literally was born over the rice and poppadoms and naan breads, and Nick was a key part to it happening as well, because he was the technical brains behind television. Professionally, Nick's he's now a sound technician. Is that what they call it, or a sound recordist? And he works for particularly for the BBC quite a lot as a sound man. So if you've ever seen a television production take place, he's the guy who's got the boom microphone on a long stick up in the air, or he's the one who's rigged up all the presenters and the guests with, the little lapel mics, the little radio mics that clip on your shirt. And he's very busy with television production that way. And not only that, Nick has high definition cameras. He has the editing equipment and the post-production equipment to put together the TX Factor program. And basically the three of us coming together via amateur radio and a curry and a beer has then enabled us to make shows about amateur radio, and that's how it started.
So what do you think is unique about the TX Factor program now that you've been doing it a while and you've kind of seen the field?
I guess when we started it, we only ever envisaged it being a kind of UK-based thing. So it's unique in that it is very UK-based, and it's aimed at a UK audience, but it does attract a huge overseas audience too. So I guess the unique thing is that it taps into British amateur radio activities. We've covered lots of activities since we're in the fourth year of us putting episodes out now. So we've covered lots of stuff, and we're not precious about what we cover. We'll cover a small local rally to a big event that involves hundreds of people behind the scenes, and the fact that we're, I guess, touching base with the roots of amateur radio at a level that locals will recognize. Radio hams will go, oh yeah, I go to that, or I'm interested in that because I watch things like that because I like seeing them talk about things that we do, as well as the reviews of equipment and the exploits that we get involved in. I guess we're just, we're just trying to capture what other radio hams do and the things that we're passionate about, as well, because we're radio hams,
Looking through the TX Factor lens, is there something about amateur radio that you've discovered that you didn't know before? Yeah,
all the time. With a lot of the productions that we've gotten involved in, we've gone behind the scenes actually at the BBC a couple of times. So they've been in the newsroom there and met up with Jim Lee, G4AEH, who's an announcer for BBC Radio 4. So they've had a good, I didn't get involved in that shoot, unfortunately, but Bob and Nick had a good guided tour around the BBC, which was an eye-opener for them. Bob's visited Goonhilly Earth Station on a couple of occasions now. And in fact, in a previous episode, had a very successful Earth-Moon-Earth contact using the 10 million meter wide dish that they've got down there, which is huge. I mean, it's absolutely awesome sight. So doing TX Factor, I guess, has opened the doors for us to get behind the scenes of a lot of things that you wouldn't normally see, you know, within amateur radio, and look deeper into the kind of technical aspects of it too, and talk to experts in their field. That's the key with doing this show, is I guess we're getting straight to the horse's mouth and not just scratching the surface of a subject, but, you know, getting a little bit deeper involved in stuff. So I know that every time we do a shoot, whether I'm there or all of us are there, we've learned something about amateur radio every time without question, you know.
Now, does Nick do all of the post-production, or is that kind of shared by the three of you?
No, Nick does the whole lot. It falls on his head because he has all the gear to do it, and he's got a studio set up at home where he does all the post-production, all the editing, all the overlaying of all the different soundtracks. Bob and I will get involved in, you know, perhaps voicing parts of the show that need voicing externally. We can do that from home. But of course, using the internet, we then upload a WAV file to Nick, and he can overlay any audio that we need to add at post-production stage in his studio at home. So, unfortunately, Nick gets the short straw in terms of the extra work involved because, well, you probably know as well as anybody that editing anything takes ages, but editing a television show that needs to make sense visually and audibly is a huge time-consuming process. And actually, without Nick, this TX Factor would definitely not be possible.
How many episodes of the TX Factor have you produced to date?
So there are 21 episodes out there now. Episode 21 was released last Friday, which was the 1st of June. And we started, the first episode went out in 2014. So we're not, how would you say?
It's not a weekly or, you know,
No.
even bi-weekly show.
Yeah, that's right. We're not massively productive. And the reason is the time constraints. You know, Bob, Nick, and myself have all got full-time jobs. So TX Factor was always going to be a hobby job. And we don't get to spend as much time as we would like on it at the moment at all, you know. Ideally, we would like to try and put 6 episodes out a year, which means one every 2 months. But the prep work and the field work and the on-location work and the traveling just eats into the spare time that we do have. It would be great to do a show every week. But, you know, time constraints are such that to do a show to what we like to think of the standard that we're doing, which hopefully looks very professional, takes time. It's not something that you can coddle together really, really quickly. And, you know, when you're involving third parties, you need to prep up the meeting times and make sure everybody's diaries match up and stuff like that. So it's a time-consuming. Making telly is a time-consuming process. I think if we were all retirees who were twiddling our thumbs all day long, we'd probably be making a show every day. But you know, it's a time thing. So at the moment, because we're still busy bees, an episode every 2 months is probably about as much as we can manage to do.
Does the TX Factor have a production framework so that you kind of follow the same framework from episode to episode?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, there is a little bit of let's make it up as we go along. Nick has been very good in instilling in myself and Bob the more professional aspect of making TV, because Nick makes TV for a living. He sees it from a whole different perspective, with like a producer, a director, 5 cameramen, a script to follow, and things like that. When we first started with TX Factor, Nick was quite adamant that that's how we should produce the shows. You know, we've got to have a script, we've got to have a timeline to follow. So Bob and I, we didn't really get on with that because we come from broadcast radio, which is definitely make it up as you go along. You don't really go in to do a radio show and know what you're going to say. You turn up and do it. You might have the music all sorted, but the links, you just make it up as you go along. So Bob and I, we quickly sort of instilled in Nick that, you know, this script thing, how about we rip that up and we just kind of busk it a bit more. So the framework is it's scheduled, but also a little bit off the cuff. Stuff happens that might not necessarily have been planned. And I think that's the beauty of it sometimes, is that because we're not following a rigid structure, anything can happen, you know. And actually, when you're working on amateur radio shoots, you know what it's like yourself. If you've planned a QSO with somebody, or you've planned to do something with your radio, it doesn't work out that way. And you have to adjust what you're doing. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to adjust what you're doing to make it work. So shooting TX Factor can be very much like that, because amateur radio is the subject, that never remains the same. So the regimentation of it goes out the window, and you have to make it up as you go along, particularly when other people are involved, or, you know, you're covering a topic such as satellites. Bob and I did a shoot with Nick where we were covering an FM satellite, and of course if you miss a pass, you've then got to hope that the next one works out okay. And Bob was doing that EME shoot down at Goonhilly. Are you going to be successful or aren't you? Are there going to be technical issues that crop up during the shoot? Those things nearly always happen, but you have to find a way to get around it. So we definitely have a structure to how the show's put together, and if Nick's listening to this now, he'll be tapping me on the shoulder, going, "Listen, everything is completely regimented. I'm in full control here. I know what's going on." And he's really good when we do a shoot, by the way. He's always thinking one step ahead. Nick's always thinking. He's thinking about the edit. So if we're shooting something and he knows that it won't edit together properly, or there are too many pauses or too many mistakes or whatever, he will just completely make us reshoot it and retake it, you know. So his professionalism from that point of view is absolutely what makes the show come together and look like Bob and I and Nick, when he presents, know what we're actually doing. Whereas the truth is, certainly I speak for myself, I'm making it up as I go along.
One of our sponsors is Soda Beams, and in episode 16 of the TX Factor, you conducted a test on your vertical antenna from your QTH with the Soda Beams Whisper Light 250 milliwatt test transmitter. What did you discover from that test?
Yeah, I remember that very well. And do you know what? That test alone completely restored my own faith in my HF radio setup at home here, because like I said to you earlier, I'm a big listener and not really a talker, and every time I've tried to be a talker, nobody's ever come back to me. So my key thing with HF at home is maybe my system is just no good, you know. And it's all about the antenna. And as I was saying, I've got a Hustler 5 BTV vertical out in the garden, and maybe I've not put it all in properly. I haven't dug the radials into the ground and, you know, trashed the lawn to do that. So I put it in with a ground spike, a ground mount, and it's grounded as well. But I just threw it up in the air in the typical traditions of amateur radio. You want to get something working as quick as possible. And I didn't go the full hog and do what I should have done. So therefore, I've always been a bit disappointed with my HF setup in that I don't think it works very well, and I don't think I've set it up properly. But having that SOTA Beams Whisper Light I had it for, I think, about a fortnight on soak here before we shot the episode. That completely changed my view on on my antenna. And remember, I was only using 200 milliwatts transmission power using that thing, and to see the little receive spots come up on the web page that other stations were hearing me, across Europe and I think even east coast of the US on 200 milliwatts from a Hustler vertical. Are you joking me? I was like, whoa, okay. So I learned massive amounts about propagation. What is a good time of the day to be on what band at any given time? Stuff that I didn't even know before because I've never been a hardcore HF radio user, So having that SOTA Beams Whisper Light was instrumental in me actually getting my head around what goes on the HF bands, and the fact that my HF aerial actually was performing okay. And you need to get to grips with the fact that you need to be on at certain times of the day and stuff like that, So, yeah, it was a game changer for me. It really was an eye-opener within my own shack.
Now, Mike, you're a busy person. Do you have other hobbies besides work in ham radio?
Yeah, music. Still music, even though that's my job. I absolutely love music. I guess my other hobby, well, apart from doing sports and stuff like that with my son, who's fast growing up now, I play a lot of squash, and I try and keep fit by running and stuff like that. But I guess my other main hobby is probably cooking. I absolutely love cooking. When you do what I do, I think you'll find a lot of engineers and a lot of musicians love cooking too, because cooking is just like making music. You've got this ingredients and random list of things that you need to put together to make an end result. And I absolutely love nothing better than being in the kitchen for 3 or 4 hours. It might end up being a complete disaster of a dish, but I've had great fun doing it, and I'm always up for new flavors. I can't stand bland food or convenience food or junk food and stuff like that. I like to think I've got a fairly healthy diet, keep myself in good shape, and I totally believe what my mother told me as a child, which is you are what you eat. So for me, yeah, cooking is it's about looking after yourself, but it's about having fun in the kitchen too, Always got to have a glass of wine on the go while you're cooking. I think that helps, and releases the tension, and the cooking juices just get flowing, And actually, even with my son, from a very young age, I've been teaching him the joys of preparing and making your own food, and he's grown up having no kind of dislikes with food, no food allergies, none of this kind of, I don't want to eat that looks horrible, or any of those kind of mealtime tantrums. He's just embraced loads of food, and maybe I like to think it's part of the fact that he's been there at the chopping board with me since 2 years old, since he was old enough to hold a knife safely. So he's learnt a lot about food, and and for me as well, it's a big way to relax. Amateur radio is a big part of that's probably my biggest hobby. But, sometimes you need a break from the radio. And after all, we've all got to eat, So cooking is great fun. I'm really passionate about it. I love it.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Wow. And you know what? The hobby just doesn't stand still. I think probably the expansion of digital and data modes and digital voice. Yeah, I mean, I like to think I was kind of on the cusp of very early digital modes back in the day, because myself and Dave, G6XUV, and John, G6YWX, back in the day, we were one of the first guys to get involved in packet radio. And, that effectively is a digital mode. It's a data mode from back in the day. This was in the early to mid-90s. We built our own Baycom software modems. I remember John etching circuit boards in his kitchen and dishing them out to members of the radio club locally. And we built our own modems, which we then connected up to pretty clunky old computers back in the day. And we were communicating via packet radio, and it was fantastic. So that's kind of expanded into a whole new ball game now, isn't it? Packet radio sort of died off for a bit, and in fact, I think just digital within radio disappeared. It didn't happen. The internet came along and ruined all that. You know, the fact that you could send somebody an email. What's the point of packet radios? So mobile phones came along. That was a game changer too. So, but right now, for me, as a current radio ham of quite a few years, the hobby is just not standing still. Look at D-Star, look at DMR, look at Fusion from the digital voice point of view, and then look at what's going on digital modes. FT8 is great fun now. Not long gone are the days of RTTY and SSTV. That's still a thriving niche of the hobby, but my goodness, hasn't it exploded into this whole new exciting kettle of fish that you could never have anticipated. So that's what really excites me, because the hobby is still moving fast, and you know what, there's still so much to learn. I don't think even now, trying to play all the different facets of the hobby, I've still got to go and check Google and find somebody else who's done something before me, just to get some tips on how to get something to work, or stuff like that. So yeah, in a word, digital modes.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Wow. I mentioned that Google word just now, didn't I?
You did.
If you've not been in the hobby for a while, which happens to a lot of people, they've been out of using their radios for 20 years for whatever reasons, bringing up kids, doing their job, whatever, it gets in the way. If you're coming back to the hobby, my goodness, are you going to be in for a shock? Because if you're going to dig out your old equipment from back in the day, some of it, I'm sure, is still going to work, but some of it isn't going to actually be capable of doing what you want to do. Like, for example, CTCSS. Are your old radios going to have that for your repeater access? You're certainly not going to be able to get on the digital modes, because that isn't going to happen with the old analog radios. So for anybody coming back to the hobby, I would say definitely get on Google and see what's out there in terms of the way the hobby has just expanded recently. And that includes perhaps going on to, your local ham radio store and looking at what equipment's available, because there is just a smorgasbord of stuff now that you're going to have to get your head around. That's before you even touch on the things like SDR radios and stuff like that, operating your radio via a computer, stuff that people would never, ever have considered possible back in the day, even when we were using packet radio on computers. Now, a computer is an absolute center point of anybody's shack. So to a new operator, it's going to be a steep learning curve. The old tricks are the same, the conversations are the same, and you can still have fun with the radio, but it's the way you go about it. You've got quite a lot to learn, I think. So good luck if you've been out of the hobby for a long time and you want to come back to it, because I know that even myself, who still plays the game, and new stuff comes along, my goodness, have you got to do some research before you can get something to work?
That's absolutely true. Mike, you've been a wonderful guest. I've had so much fun learning about what you're doing there in the UK, especially in the music industry, and as well with TX Factor. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and I hope that I work you sometime on one of these many modes that you seem to be operating on.
Yeah, definitely. Well, which modes are you active on yourself most popularly?
Well, right now I'm on All Star, which is so we have a UHF All Star network here in Israel that we're building out, and when I'm in town, I'm on DMR. So I'm learning DMR, and I'm to a point where I think I said this in an earlier podcast, I'm going to fuse All Star to DMR so I can stay on All Star but still talk to my friends on DMR.
Fantastic. And I love it when you say you're learning DMR, because, being in the hobby for X amount of years, you're still learning something new. So how fantastic is that?
Well, that's the thing about it. Ham radio is such a large tent now, a big tent, that it's very easy to get distracted by all of the golden things in the store. So I tell people, go to one thing and master it. So in the case of DMR, DMR was made for commercial use, and the way that we're using it as hams, I think, is a little different. And so there's some idiosyncrasies of DMR that either we have to get our head around, or we have to figure out a way to modify it so that it works more the way we want to use it. I think I'm kind of on the second side of that. I'd like to see some software development that makes it more ham radio friendly, and I think that's certainly possible.
Definitely, that is going to happen. I think because DMR is still in its infancy, really, in terms of being something that we can use in amateur radio. So you absolutely know that there'll be somebody out there who's thinking the same as you, and somebody who can make those modifications or take a radio and get it to do what we want it to do. So your wish will be granted one day. I know it.
Well, I think so. Yeah, I'd say that one of the idiosyncrasies of DMR that I see that I don't like is I could be listening to a talk group, and then all of a sudden I'm in the middle of a conversation in that talk group, and the person I'm talking to disappears. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. It's possible that maybe he's talking on a time slot that's shared with other talk groups and somebody took him away, or I'm talking on a time slot that's shared and somebody took me away. But either way, I'm not sure who went away or how we went away, but we're just no longer talking. So I think, that's... I think everybody's experiencing this, and at some point we'll figure out a way to, keep that from happening. I could see where it's possible. It seems to me possible that these two talk groups should be able to support multiple conversations at the same time. Maybe you increase the data output or whatever. I don't really know yet. I'm trying to think about this. But the great thing about ham radio and about this is that it's a new problem to solve that we'll solve, and then it'll find its way probably into the big market, and hams once again will be the pioneers and the leaders in new technology.
Yeah, as has been so often the case, throughout the hobby, it's often down to the radio hams who've got the experience to have a fiddle around to get something to work, or even the interest in getting something to happen, because most of the time we're just doing all of these little things for ourselves, aren't we? So the fact that we're all fairly like-minded in the hobby and that we want to get things to work for each other, it's fantastic. It feeds everybody else's interest. And often somebody will have a breakthrough. So, and I know what you mean about the conversations dropping and then somebody being there 1 minute and then disappearing, and you seem to be going like back over your last couple of overs, repeating what you said because somebody didn't hear what you said because you dropped out, and that's frustrating. But maybe some of that's down to internet speeds and, of course, other people's connection methods and stuff. There are a lot of variables involved, and with DMR and with a lot of the digital networks, it's not like we're just using a radio, a microphone, and an aerial anymore. Now there's a few other bits that can throw a spanner in the works along the way, aren't there?
Right, and I guess what's good about this I'm not frustrated from this. I'm puzzled, and I guess puzzled means, okay, so let's take some time and figure out why this is happening, and it's a problem to solve, and we like problems, don't we? It's it's our bread and butter.
Absolutely. If there was nothing to think about, the hobby would get boring.
That's right, and the great thing about ham radio now is there's absolutely plenty to think about. Mike, thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
You're very welcome,
I know we've been
Eric.
talking a long time, and I'm glad we finally had this opportunity. So with that, I'm going to wish you 73.
All right, Eric. Great to catch up with you as well. 7-3, and maybe catch you on the air one day.
I look forward to it.
Okay. Take care, man.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G1IAR in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, and when you purchase your next rig, that you tell them that you heard it here on QSO Today. Some of the QSO Today episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It really makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, the iTunes Store, and Stitcher. You can even ask Alexa to play the QSO Today podcast. Amazing. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.